The morning Delia Marsh drove her truck through the gate of the Harmon County Fairgrounds. The air already tasted of iron, and the crowd had been waiting in that particular way. Crowds wait when they believe the outcome is settled before the first gavel falls. She stood at the back of the bidding ring with her canvas jacket buttoned to the throat and her hands folded in front of her, and every person who glanced at her glanced away again without registering much, which was how it usually went. A woman alone at a sale barn is either a curiosity or a pity. And the consensus at Harmon County in those days ran closer to pity. She had $22 in her coat pocket and the deed to 40 acres of gray limestone hardpan that the previous owner had walked away from after 2 bad years, and she had driven 90 miles in the dark to be standing exactly where she was standing. One front of a pen that held a single Nubian doe with a left hind leg that tremored when she stood, and a Roman nose so pronounced it looked like a small cliff. The pen card said, LOT 47. Grade Doe. 4YR. 1 sound. Beside the card, someone had penciled in letters that were not unkind, but were not careful either. Lame. The auctioneer skipped her twice, moving on to the Boer Weathers and the registered Sun and Does, and the long row of percentage duelings that drew spirited bids from the commercial men in their good hats. He came back to lot 47 only because he had to, and he did it with the tone a man uses when he is clearing a table. Delia raised her hand at $19. Nobody raised a finger after that. The gavel came down, and the auctioneer had moved on before the sound finished traveling across the ring. That was how Delia Marsh acquired the animal that would, in 37 months, produce a line of dairy stock that topped the Harmon County goat sale for 3 consecutive years. But that accounting belongs to the end of the story, and the land had already written the end. Before Delia ever arrived, the land always does if you learn to read its handwriting. The real verdict on what she had bought was rendered not by the auctioneer's gavel, and not by the crowd that laughed when she led the doe to her trailer, but by the limestone ground itself, which had been waiting for exactly this kind of patience. It does not announce itself loudly, the land. It whispers, and you have to go very quiet to hear it. She had left Galesburg the week before with $940 and the title to the Harmon place, which had come to her to a courthouse auction for back taxes after her great-aunt passed without heirs willing to claim what looked like a liability. The 40 acres had been appraised by the county assessor at $6,200, and by every neighbor within 5 miles at considerably less. The road that ran to it was half caliche and half wish, and the house had a roof that had made its peace with leaking. She had spent $412 on roofing tin and hardware, $63 on feed, and $19 on the dough. That left $446 against whatever the first season intended to cost her. She had done this arithmetic with a pencil and a lined notebook at the kitchen table on her first night in the house, sitting under a Coleman lantern because the electric had been off for 8 months. And she had looked at the column of numbers for a long time before she closed the notebook and went to check on the dough in the shed she had patched with salvaged lumber. The dough stood in the far corner of the shed on her 3 sound legs, holding the tremoring one slightly lifted, and she watched Delia the way a creature watches when it has learned that watching is safer than trusting. Delia crouched down and did not reach for her. She just stayed there in the lantern light until the doe put her foot down and left it down, which was something. Delia called her lot, which is what the pen card had said, and she meant it without irony. You get what you're given. You make of it what you can. She went to bed and lay in the dark listening to the August heat move through the walls, and thought about the arithmetic, and then stopped thinking about it and went to sleep. Because the arithmetic was not going to change overnight and sleep was free. Harlan Voss came to see her about 3 weeks after she moved in. He drove a white pickup with a ranch logo on the door that she recognized as the brand of the Consolidated Valley Grazing Cooperative, which was the polite name for the operation that had been buying out or crowding out the small holders in the county for about 6 years. Voss himself was polished in the way that expensive boots are polished, and he had a smile that arrived a half second before his eyes changed to match it, which she noticed and filed away. He said he had heard she had moved on to the Harmon place, and he wanted to welcome her to the valley, and he said it warmly, and looked at the shed, and at the 40 acres of gray stone and scrubby browse, and at the nanny standing in the lot, and then he looked at Delia in the way a man looks when he has already tabulated the terms of an offer. He said the cooperative had an interest in consolidating the parcel, that it adjoined their grazing lease to the north, and that he was prepared to offer her $12,000 for a clean deed transfer. He said, given her situation, he imagined that was a generous start. She said she was not selling. He said the ground was limestone hardpan and would not carry cattle, and was too steep for row crops, and she might find the winters harder than she expected. She said she expected them to be hard. He said the offer stood and left a card and drove back up the half-Calitcha road, with the kind of unhurried pace that meant he was confident in his own timeline. Delia looked at the card for a moment and put it in the coffee can, where she kept her pencils. Lota Euro's leg did not improve and did not worsen. The vet who came out in September, a young woman named Pryor who drove a dented truck and charged sliding rates for small holders, said the joint had old ligament damage, probably from a kidding injury nobody had bothered to address, and that, with careful terrain and consistent handling, the animal was likely functional. She said she was sorry there was not more she could do. Delia said she had not asked for more. Pryor looked at the 40 acres of limestone with the particular gaze of a person revising a first impression and said the browse on this ground was unusual, that the scrub included species she did not often see on valley operations, and that Nubians in particular were well suited to rough browse. She said it the way people say things that are true, but that they do not expect to matter to anyone. Delia listened the way she listened to everything, which was completely. The worst of it that first autumn was the loneliness, which was not simple loneliness, but the specific kind that comes from being perceived as a failure while you are simply working. She drove into town for hardware and feed, and the men at the co-op were not cruel. Just indifferent in the way of people who have already sorted you into a category. She heard the phrase, a woman alone, more times than she counted. Always at a slight angle. Always in a tone that meant it as a verdict rather than a description. She took it as a description and drove home and fed Lot and split firewood and mended the fence on the south pasture and wrote the week's arithmetic in the notebook and went to bed. She was not unaware that it was hard. She was just not interested in its opinion of her. End foot. The elder who lived on the 60 acres to the south was named Ephraim Soto, and he had come from Oaxaca 40 years before and had grown older in the way that certain people grow older, becoming more concentrated rather than diminished. His English was complete, but he distributed it carefully. He appeared at her fence line on a Thursday in October, carrying a small jar of something, and said he had come to introduce himself because he had watched the Harmon place sit empty for 2 years, and it had grieved him, and now someone was there. He handed her the jar, which held a dark, soft cheese wrapped in cloth. He said it was from his does, which were 3 old Nubians on his south slope, and he said, in a cadence that she would recognize later as his native register for the things that mattered, the ground tells you what it can feed, and the animal tells you what the ground is saying. You only have to keep yourself from talking long enough to hear either one. He looked at Lot in the lot, and at the browse on the limestone, and he said that ground like this, fractured and south-facing, was full of aromatic herbs that city goats never tasted, and that Nubians were old desert animals who had been browsing that kind of ground for 4,000 years before anyone thought to put them on improved pasture and call that progress. He said he thought her animal was sound enough to kid in spring if she came through winter in condition, and that she should let the doe range the whole 40 rather than pen her, because Lot would choose the browse that suited her, and the ground would be the better for it too. He said, a field that is listened to gives back. A field that is managed only gives until it cannot. Then he said he had kept her long enough and went home along the fence line. She let Lot range. Through November and December, she watched the doe work the 40 acres with an authority that her bad leg did not diminish, picking a path along the limestone outcrops to the aromatic scrub on the south face with a deliberateness that looked after a while less like grazing and more like reading. In January, a neighbor 2 miles east let his Nubian buck run the fence line during breeding season, which was not an accident Delia had planned, but was an accident she recognized. She watched Lot stand at the fence, and she opened the gate and let the encounter be what the season required. In February, she moved Lot into the shed with fresh straw and a heat lamp borrowed from Pryor, and she sat up 2 nights in succession until Lot delivered twin duelings, both sound on all 4 legs, both with the long Nubian ears and the Roman noses that the sale barn crowd considered comic, and the old desert lineages had been perfecting since before the Harmon County Fairgrounds existed. She named the duelings clause and verse because they were the beginning of a new sentence in her notebook. The arithmetic that week for the first time had an entry on the right side of the ledger, not in dollars, but in potential, and she let herself write it in ink instead of pencil. Ephraim came by in March and looked at the kids and at Lot, who was in milk now, and he tasted the milk from the jar. Delia offered him, and he was quiet for a moment, and then he said it was what he expected from that ground. He said the aromatic browse concentrated in the milk, the way soil concentrates in a root, and that the flavor of a goat's milk was the autobiography of everything she had eaten, and that what Lot had been eating on that 40 acres was a library that most dairy goats never opened. Delia had begun making cheese from the surplus milk, rough and dark as Ephraim's, and she had sent 3 wheels to Pryor in payment for the lamp. Pryor had eaten 1 and taken the other 2 to a restaurant in the county seat where a chef named Rodrigue worked, who had come from the city and was known for sourcing unusual things. Rodrigue sent Pryor back with a note that said simply, "Who made this, and does she have more?" Delia wrote that in the notebook too. A boy named Cass Whitfield, who was 9 and belonged to the Whitfield family that rented the scrub place 3 miles north, had begun appearing at her fence line in March without announcement and without apparent purpose. He was a quiet child with a direct gaze and the economical movement of a person who has learned not to waste energy on gestures that did not accomplish anything. He did not ask to help. He simply began helping in the unhurried way of a child who has not been taught to perform helpfulness, but only to do it. He named all 5 goats that Delia now had, including Lot and the 2 kids, and 2 additional does she had acquired from Ephraim at cost, when his herd exceeded his land. He named Lot's dominant kid Cornerstone, which struck Delia as too large a name for an animal 4 months old and exactly right for the animal she was becoming. Cass came after school on Wednesdays and Saturdays, and he asked almost no questions and made almost no mistakes, and by June he could read Lot's condition from across the pen, and had twice told Delia, with the certainty of a child who does not yet know to hedge, that a doe was about to go off her feed, and had been right both times. He said once, looking at the herd working the south face of the limestone, "They know where the good stuff is." Delia said yes. He said, "Why don't other people's goats look like this?" She said, "Because other people's goats are not asked what they know." He considered this for a while and then went back to mending the feeder. Rodrigues paid $11 a pound for the first lot of cheese she sold him in April, which was more than she had paid for Lot herself. He bought 6 pounds. She wrote $66 on the income side of the notebook and looked at it for a long time. The cheese was unusual because the ground was unusual, which was what Ephraim had said and what Pryor had suspected without saying directly, and what the land had been saying all along in the language of aromatic scrub on south-facing limestone that nobody had thought to listen to because they were too busy calling it worthless. She kept the sale quiet. She bought a second heat lamp and 3 more feeders and a good quality portable electric fence, and she expanded the ranging area, and she did not mention Rodrigues or the price to anyone at the co-op when she went in for mineral supplement in May. She was banking something, the way you bank a coal in ash to carry fire through the night without light. She was not ready for the light yet. The arithmetic was still too thin, and the margin between survival and disaster was still narrow enough that a single bad month could close it. But the direction had changed, and direction is what you guard when the numbers are still small. Voss came back in June with a revised offer of $15,000 and a packet of paper that cited the county's new grazing assessment and suggested that the limestone designation made the parcel eligible for a conservation easement that would significantly limit her options for development. She read the packet. She said that she was not developing the property, she was farming it. He said the easement would nonetheless constrain the parcel's value, and that his offer represented a fair price in light of those constraints. She said she was familiar with the easement process, and that an easement required a landowner's consent. He said that was currently the case. The word currently sat in the air between them. She said the offer was not something she was interested in. He said he hoped she would reconsider, given her situation. She heard the phrase with the same precision. She heard everything, and she watched him drive away. And then she went inside and called the county extension office and the legal aid clinic in Harrisburg, and she spent an afternoon understanding exactly what the easement law permitted and did not permit. And she wrote the relevant statute numbers in the back of the notebook, where she kept things she might need to find. Again quickly, the summer was dry, that is, too mild a word for what the summer was. By late July, the Harmon Valley had not had measurable rain in 11 weeks, and the pastures of the cattle operations to the north were the color of old straw, and the stock tanks were showing their clay bottoms, and the alfalfa that the commercial operations depended on was burning in the field before it was ready to cut. Delia's 40 acres of limestone hardpan, which held no alfalfa and no improved pasture, was doing what limestone hardpan does in a drought, which is not dying. The scrubby aromatics on the south face were deep-rooted into the fractured rock and drawing moisture that was not available on the surface, and the goats were ranging to them with the unhurried confidence of animals whose ancestors had walked the same kind of ground in the same kind of heat for 1,000 years before anyone invented an improved pasture. She was buying supplemental hay, which strained the arithmetic, but she was buying it before the shortage became a crisis, which meant she was buying it at prices that were not yet desperate, because she had read the dry summer coming in May, when the soil cracked in a particular way along the south fence, and she had stacked 2 months of hay in the barn while it was still affordable. Ephrem told her in March, in his careful cadence, that ground like this cracks before it shows what it knows. When you see the cracks, the test is already beginning. She had written it in the notebook. By August, the valley cattle operations were in serious trouble. The Consolidated Cooperative sent an emergency request to the county for drought assistance funding, which was in the newspaper, which was how Delia learned the scope of what had happened to her neighbors. The Whitfields, Cass's family, had sold their thin herd of stalker cattle at a loss in July, rather than watch them through a dry August, and the income from the sale had gone to arrears on their lease, and they were managing on what the garden produced and what Cass's father earned doing custom work for the larger operations. Cass still came on Wednesdays and Saturdays, and Delia had begun paying him $2 an hour from the cheese income, which was a small sum and a serious one in his household, and he had said thank you, with a brevity that meant it exactly. Rodriguez had been buying cheese steadily through the spring and early summer, and in July he drove out himself for the first time in a small clean car that looked wrong on the Kalish Road. And he walked the operation, and looked at the herd, and tasted the current batch, and said he wanted to talk about a consistent supply arrangement. He named a price per pound that made Delia hold her expression still with some effort. He said the flavor profile was specific to this ground and this management, and he had not been able to source anything comparable from any other producer in 4 states, and that his menu now featured the cheese under a name she had not chosen, which was Hill Limestone Reserve, and that his customers asked for it specifically. She said she was listening. He said he could commit to 30 pounds per month at the price he had named if she could commit to the volume. She looked at the arithmetic in her head, the herd size, the ranging area, the milk yield, the aging schedule, and she said she believed she could reach that volume by spring with current herd growth. He said he would take what she had in the interim. At the same rate, she said that was acceptable. He drove back down the Calitch Road, and she stood in the lot for a moment in the August heat, and then she went to find Cass and told him she was raising his wage to $3 an hour, effective immediately, which was the only extravagance she permitted herself that month. She did not tell the co-op. She did not tell the neighbors. What they knew was that she was still out there on the limestone hardpan with her gimpy-legged nanny and her small herd and her primitive operation, struggling through the same drought as everyone else, which was what she let them see because it was what they expected to see and because the coal was still banked and the time was not right. The time would be right when the need was real, and the drought was making the need very real indeed. Harlan Voss came back in September, and this time he did not come alone. He brought a man from the cooperative's legal office in San Marcos and a third person who was introduced as a county water and land use consultant, and the meeting he requested was at the fairgrounds rather than at her property, which she recognized as a staging choice. He said the cooperative had applied to the county for an emergency agricultural consolidation order under the drought relief statute, which would allow them to bring certain underperforming parcels into a managed conservation status under cooperative administration, with fair compensation to the landowners. He slid a document across the table. The compensation listed for her parcel was $9,000, which was less than either of his previous offers, and was described in the document as a final settlement against operating losses incurred by the county drought district. She read the document the way she read things, all the way through. She said she would need to speak with her attorney. Voss said he did not know she had retained counsel. She said she had made it a point to do so. This was not precisely true yet, but it was true by the following Tuesday, when she drove to Harrisburg and retained a woman from the legal aid clinic who had the word water in her professional specialty and who looked at the cooperative's consolidation document and said, over the top of her reading glasses, "This is written to frighten people who don't read statutes." She said the emergency order required landowner consent unless the parcel was in active default of county tax obligations, which Delia's was not, having been brought current at the time of purchase. She said she would write a response letter and that Voss would know on receipt that he was dealing with someone who had read the statute. She charged Delia $140, which went into the notebook on the left side and stayed there without apology. Cass came on a Saturday in late September and found Delia at the aging shelf in the cellar she had begun using for the cheese, and he looked at the wheels lined up in the cool dark, and he counted them without being asked, the way he did things, and he said, "That is a lot of cheese." She said yes. He looked at Lot, who had come in from ranging and was standing in the shed doorway with the afternoon light behind her. Her bad leg lifted slightly in the way it lifted when she was tired, her Roman nose in profile, her long ears down in the late summer droop that meant she was content. He said, "Lot looks like she knows something." Delia said she probably does. He said she always did. He went back to the feeder repair without further ceremony, and Delia thought that Cass was one of the few people in the valley who had never once referred to her situation as though her situation were the most important thing about her. The meeting at the fairgrounds in October was not a meeting Voss had arranged. It was a county drought relief meeting called by the Extension Service, open to all agricultural landholders in the district, and the auditorium held 112 people, most of them operators of cattle and hay enterprises who were in various stages of financial crisis. She sat near the back. The extension agent outlined the programs available, the emergency feed assistance, the low-interest operating loans, the grazing lease assistance, and the amounts were modest against the scale of what the summer had cost the valley. Voss was near the front, and he stood and said that the consolidated cooperative was prepared to offer individual operators a buy-in arrangement that would consolidate their land under cooperative management in exchange for leaseback agreements, which he presented as a lifeline. Several people nodded. Several people had the look of those who are considering a thing they do not like because they cannot think of an alternative. Then Earl Hobbs stood up. Earl was the largest cattle operator in the north end of the valley, and he had been the loudest voice in the sale barn the day lot was auctioned. The one who had said, in a carrying voice, that the Marsh woman was paying $19 for the privilege of burying a goat. Earl Hobbs was also, by September, 4 months behind on his operating loan and had sold 60 head at drought prices and was looking at a winter that did not add up. He was a large man with a reputation for volume, and that evening he spoke quietly, which was more alarming than the volume would have been. He said he needed 60 tons of hay to bring his remaining herd through to spring, and he could not source it at any price he could pay. And he wanted to know if the relief programs covered anything close to that gap, and the answer from the extension table was that they did not. He sat down. The room was quiet. In the way rooms are quiet, when the arithmetic is plain and the outcome is visible, and nobody wants to say it out loud. Delia sat in the back and did her own arithmetic, which she had been doing since August, and which she had been refining, since Rodrigue had called her in September to say he had a connection to a commercial hay broker who had a lot in storage in the Panhandle. And could she use a contact? She had called the broker and arranged a price before the drought was fully general news, and she had committed to 10 tons for her own operation and had asked quietly about the possibility of a community purchase order. And the broker had said that a purchase order for 60 tons or more in a single transaction would carry a substantially different price than individual orders would. She had written that number in the notebook and had been carrying it since. She stood up. The room shifted in that particular way. Rooms shift when someone unexpected stands. Voss turned in his seat. She said she had a hay broker contact with 60 tons available at a stored lot price that was substantially below the current market, and that she was prepared to organize a community purchase if a sufficient number of the operators in the room wanted to participate, and that she would share the broker's contact and terms that same night. She said the price per ton. The room went very still. Hobbs turned around and looked at her from the front of the room with an expression she had not seen on his face in the years she had known him. She said she was not a broker and was not charging a fee. She said she was a neighbor who had gotten there first by a different road and who did not see the point of keeping that to herself. Voss stood. He said it was a generous offer, and he wanted to be sure the room understood that the quality of hay from Panhandle storage lots was variable and that the cooperative could source certified hay through established channels at prices competitive with whatever she was describing. He said this with the warmth that arrived before his eyes. Delia waited for him to finish. Then she said the broker had certified the lot in July before the drought was public, and that she had a copy of the certification, and that she would be happy to share it, and that she had spoken to the broker about this specific meeting, and he had agreed to hold the lot for 48 hours pending a group decision. She said she could also share the email correspondence from the broker, if anyone wanted to verify the terms. She said the correspondence included all the details of the arrangement, including the date the lot was identified and reserved. She said the lot had been identified in early August. Voss said, in August the valley had not yet declared a drought emergency, and there had been no public indication of the shortage at that scale. He said, how did she know to reserve hay in August? He said it with a fraction too much precision, the kind of precision that belongs to someone who has read the relevant documents and knows the timeline in detail that he had no reason to know unless he had been watching her operation more carefully than a disinterested man would. The question sat in the air, and she let it sit for a moment before she said that she had watched the soil along her south fence crack in May, and she had read the Extension Service's soil moisture reports in June, and she had made her own judgment from her own ground. She said if the cooperative had been watching her operation closely enough to know the date she had contacted a hay broker, she was glad her methods were of interest. The room was completely still. Voss sat down. His face had the expression of a man who understands that he has handed something to someone who will know what to do with it. Hobbs was the first person to stand and say he was in for whatever tonnage he could afford. The room followed him. She left the fairgrounds with a list of 41 names and the tonnage each needed, and the broker's number copied out 41 times on pages from the notebook. She found Hobbs in the parking lot afterward. He was standing by his truck with his hat in his hands, which was not his usual posture. He said, "I said something foolish about you and that goat at the sale barn last year." She said she remembered. He said he owed her an apology, and he said it straight and clean without ornament. She said she accepted it and asked if he had his transport organized for the hay delivery because he was the largest single buyer and coordinating his trucks would determine the timing for the others, and he said he would have it organized by morning. He put his hat back on and they discussed logistics for 10 minutes in the parking lot and then shook hands, and she drove home on the Kalish Road in the dark. The hay arrived in the third week of October, 9 trucks down from the Panhandle, and it was distributed across 11 operations in the valley over 3 days. And Hobbs ran the coordination with the efficient authority of a man who had been given a purpose he needed. Cass and his father both worked the unloading at the Whitfield place, and his father shook Delia's hand at the gate and said she had done a good thing, and she said she had done an organized thing, which is what's available to most people. The winter came hard, but it came with feed in the barn, and the valley operations that might have failed did not fail, and the operations that were already committed to Voss's buy-in arrangements began to examine those arrangements with the increased clarity that surviving a crisis provides. And 2 of them contacted her attorney, and the word statute found its way into a number of conversations. Voss did not come back to the Harmon place. She heard in March that the cooperative's consolidation application had been withdrawn, following a county review, which her attorney confirmed was related to questions about the emergency order's legal basis. She heard, in the same week, that Rodriguez had been contacted by a food publication in New York about the cheese, and that the writer was planning to visit the valley. She wrote both items in a notebook, the legal one on the left side and the cheese one on the right, and let the right side continue to outrun the left in the gradual arithmetic of a life that is working. Cornerstone, lots for Stoling, kidded in February of the 2nd year and produced twin duelings of her own, both sound, both with the long ears and the strong Nubian constitution that the limestone brows had shaped across 2 generations now. Cass named one of them Keystone and the other Meridian, and both names were too large for the animals, and exactly right. By spring of the 2nd year, the herd numbered 14 dozen production, and the cheese output was meeting Rodriguez's commitment with enough surplus to supply a 2nd restaurant in the county seat and a small market in Harrisburg. Delia hired Cass formally at a wage that was not an afterthought, and his father helped her sink the posts for the new covered aging room that spring. And Ephraim came and looked at the aging room and at the lined wheels of cheese in the cool dark and said, "You listened." She said she had tried to. He said that was the whole of it. Trying to. He looked at Lot, who was 11 years old in goat reckoning, and who ranged the south face, still on her 3 reliable legs, and one that tremored, and he said, "That one told you everything, and you only had to believe her." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "The ground that is listened to gives back more than you put in. It is not that it is generous, it is that it was always ready." Delia wrote it in the notebook. The Harmon County goat sale in the 3rd year drew buyers from 4 counties, which was unusual, and the catalog ran to 62 pages, which was the longest in the sale's history, and the section for Marsh Hill Dairy Genetics occupied 4 pages in the middle of the catalog, and carried a note from the sale manager that the consignment had topped the sale in each of the preceding 2 years and was expected to do so again. The registered does and duelings from the Lot lineage sold at prices that would have provoked disbelief in the room where the auctioneer had passed over Lot twice before coming back to her. Cornerstone's twin duelings went to a serious breeder from Hill Country at a price that Delia wrote in the notebook and then looked at for a long time before closing it. She was standing at the back of the ring in the same canvas jacket, buttoned the same way, when the last of her consignments sold. The auctioneer knew her name now and said it into the microphone. The room did not laugh. Several of the men near her said something quiet and respectful. Hobbs was 2 rows over, and he caught her eye, and nodded once with the brevity of a man who had already said what needed saying and did not intend to repeat it. Cass was beside her with a catalogue in his hand, his finger on the page where Cornerstone's offspring were listed, and he looked at the page and then at the ring and then at her and said, "They finally see it." She said they saw it when they needed to. He said, "But you saw it first." She said, "Lot saw it first. I just tried to listen." He looked at the ring for another moment, and then he said, "I am going to have my own dairy someday, on ground like yours." She said she thought that was a very good plan. She drove home on the Calitch Road in the late afternoon, the truck empty of stock, the notebook on the seat beside her with the 3rd year's final column summed in ink, and the light was long and gold on the limestone, and the aromatic scrub on the south face was silver, and the herd was ranging in their deliberate, ancient way across to 40 acres that everyone had called worthless. Olive was on the high point of the south outcrop, her bad leg lifted, her long ears forward, her Roman nose reading whatever the air was carrying off the rock, and she stayed there in the light a long time, the way she always had, the way the land had always needed her to, patient and quiet and already knowing what the ground was saying, waiting only for someone to go still enough to hear it. Ephraim had said it in October, after the hay trucks came and the valley was still and the first cold air moved down from the north. The ground does not hurry, and it does not forget, and it does not ask to be thanked. It only asks to be heard. She had written it in the notebook, and she had been writing toward it ever since. One season at a time, one wheel of cheese at a time, one quiet refusal at a time, one name in the sale catalogue at a time. A woman alone on limestone hardpan with a lame goat that nobody bid on. That is what the verdict had been, and the land had already written the other verdict before she arrived, and it had been waiting, patient as limestone, for someone to come and read it.